I pay my respect to the traditional inhabitants of the land and elders past, present. The topic is Iranian maritime arrivals in Australia and disagreement over the unsettled, or I should say disagreements over the unsettled. In April 2013, when I arrived in Australia doing my PhD in drama, the first week I attended an internal conference at Flinders University where I met one of my PhD colleagues there from the Department of Drama. She asked me, "Where are you from?" Which is pretty much the first question I get all the time here. I said, "Iran." And she said, "Oh, darling, they come here by boat." I said, "I came here by plane." And I had no idea what she was talking about. But it didn't take me long to understand the context of that comment, because, for example, I wanted to go on a website and I was seeing such a thing over there, while Australia's border protection policies will not change. Or in a couple of years, I was looking for a house and I was given this Australian visa. Laws apply to everyone. Australia won't be your home. And even if I wanted to watch a song on YouTube with Iranian lyrics, Persian lyrics, there was an advertisement at the beginning saying that Australia won't be your home in Persian, and you're not gonna actually get permission to stay here. Don't come here by boat. Those kind of things, and you can imagine how it feels when, in the eye of the society, if you're from a certain place, regardless of how you've done your life, what your purpose is, and the way you arrived here, I think it's just so much pressure. And it's still that exists, like the image of Iranian people in the eye of the public here is pretty much disparate people who come over for some for very harsh, coming from very harsh situations. So we have patronizers here a lot among us. Pretty much, I would say, unfortunately, among academics, those who research these topics, I've seen a lot of them. Instead of analyzing or supporting, we see patronizing, which is so awful. And then in the eye of the public, economic, refugees, pseudo-refugees, and those topics. But just letting you know, Iran is also one of the biggest host countries of refugees. So we can see since 1979 in Afghanistan, they've had conflicts so far. The US-led war in the longest war in the US history. Then invasion of Iraq, and Iran was one of the top 2 host countries for refugees for decades, and now after Syria's conflict, it's the 5th one. So almost 1 million documented, together with 2 million undocumented refugees. And at the same time, the aid or the support that Shah was mentioning from Australia or other countries, I think that's pretty much like a joke in their minds. So, for example, in 2017, European Union said that, okay, we will give 10 million euros to Iran for supporting refugees in the country. So you can imagine 10 million euros for 3 million refugees, that will be 3 euros per person per year. So that kind of support is not going anywhere, and that's also a part of their policies. If they wanted to help, they would have taken the refugees. They don't need to go, okay, we pay you, you should spend our money in the way you like to support people. They would have taken responsibility for that to another level. So Iran, as a big source of refugees as well, has a lot of people fleeing the country for different reasons. I'll go through in a second. Finding the statistics about it is difficult, but I luckily found this one from 1999 to 2013. For 15 years, you can see the higher the number of refugees, the less the assistance from UNHCR. But then, some people would like to know why. The major reasons 1979 Islamic Revolution. I would say prior to that revolution, many people were suffering from political issues back in home, and then many of them wanted to go overseas. For example, the Shah of Iran, in the end, wanted to have just one political party in the country, so it's kind of a sign of fascism. And if you didn't want to become a member of the party, you had to leave the country. And then, if you wanted to leave the country, you had to get your passport. To get your passport, you had to become a member of the party. So it is kind of a complicated situation. And then they have 1979 Islamic Revolution. I don't really support what the government is doing, but it's not as evil as it's portrayed in the eye of the public in Australia and elsewhere. So people think that, oh, you're gonna go to Iran. I'm like, I've been warned by many people that, are you gonna visit your home? You sure? I'm like, yeah. So there was a bomb, the plane was bombed. I was like, it was in Ukraine. Oh, so you're not afraid of ISIS? That's in Iraq, in Syria, and even in Afghanistan, but not in Iran. Oh, really? Oh, okay. So this is kind of an image that we have, because coming from Iran is like, you have to be the stereotype for whatever is happening inside and nearby. Another reason was the 1979 Islamic Revolution. People who were opposed to the new regime or linked to the previous one, they fled the country. Then we had 8-year war between Iran and Iraq. Obviously, one of the reasons for displaced people to leave the country. Then discrimination against minorities. The most familiar one in Australia would be Baha'i community, I guess. And social and political issues, most notably 2009 Green Movement, caused by some controversies after the presidential election. Many people thought that the government rigged the results, so they were protesting, and some of them ended up leaving the country. And above all, we have economic pressure caused by internal mismanagement as well as external sanctions. So these things have contributed to the reasons of leaving Iran. And one of the favorite destinations for many Iranians has been Australia. The 3 pillars of Australian immigration policy: firstly, the maintenance of British hegemony and white domination; then the strengthening of Australia's economically and militarily by selective mass migration; then the state control of these processes, as James Jock argues. He says that the first 2 has been more relaxed recently, but the third one is still working very well, and that's the main source of these problems, I guess, because when you have state control over borders and these processes, that's probably the worst thing that can contribute to the problems. A 2015 report by the Parliament shows that in 7 years, Australia only took over 800,000 refugees. I think that's an embarrassment, because this is a migration nation of 97% of people from migrant or refugee background, or being refugees or refugees or migrants themselves. So when we see this statistic, it tells us that 11,500 per year, which is nothing. Having a look at Uganda, Turkey, Lebanon, with 40% of the population are refugees, we actually should take these things into consideration, I would say. The most controversial one, as you all know, is sea arrivals. So the term boat people became more common since 1970s after the arrival of Vietnamese maritime refugees in Australia. Then on and off, I would say Labours and Liberals adopt similar approaches to this matter. And we had some restrictions, sometimes 0 refugees coming over via sea. Then we had a bit of movements. Then a mandatory detention was introduced in 1992. Took him 2 years to endorse it at the Parliament. And then in 2001, Howard's government introduced Pacific Solution, which stopped refugees, and even Kevin Rudd, when Labour took power, prior to that election, he said that, okay, we will continue doing it. But then afterwards, they said, look, we're not going to do it anymore again because it's cynical, it's costly and problematic. And sea arrivals increased, the number of them increased. So we have WikiLeaks telling us that in 2009, a key strategist of Liberal Party said that this is great, let's have more votes here, because this is the first time that Kevin Rudd's leadership is questioned widely. So then, after the rise of arrivals, so in July 2013, Rudd tries to get more votes and more attention from the public. He introduces PNG solution, which doesn't work for him. And then, since then, we have liberals in power, and the number of refugees have been almost zero since then. What was the main reason? Death. So they're dying in the sea. We're not going to see people dying. Yeah, exactly. And from 2008 to 2013, they say 862 people died reaching Australia through sea, but government usually doesn't keep the statistics of this kind of matter related to seeking asylum in Australia. Since July 2013, we've had 13 deaths of Manus and Nauru-based refugees, of which 6 of them have been Iranians. The first and the most important one, in my opinion, was Reza Barati. I say that the most important one because firstly he was killed following protests in Manus detention, and more importantly, it actually created a lot of reaction in the country. I remember in Adelaide, we gathered at Light Square, we lit candles, we had speakers talking, people were going to different public places, putting flowers or candles next to his photo and trying to commemorate him. The media reacted much more than subsequent death, and afterwards, anybody who died in the offshore detentions, they didn't attract that much attention. Why? There's a simple reason to it. A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic by someone who we don't admire much. This is so true. We failed in understanding the situation, taking the opportunity to stop offshore detentions. That was the time that we could do something for it, but we didn't actually. Kids of Nauru was another time that we could take something more deeply into consideration. We failed. I guess we're not going to get anywhere. Like, best case scenario, okay, bring them back to Australia for medical purposes, then return them to the island. So these moments, when they happen, we need to be aware and wary of the situation and do something. If not, then something bad happens. For example, in 2016, during an UNHCR visit to Nauru, asylum seeker, Iranian one, Houman Zandizadeh, protested about the conditions of his detention. Then he poured 20 liters of petrol over his body and set himself on fire in front of the UN representatives. Following that, the reaction of the government, which was so blaming itself after Reza Barati's death, was that Australia and Nauru warned other refugees against what they described as acts of political protest. So that's the way it works. When we don't act properly, when we don't occupy the public sphere, then that happens. We stay like really keyboard warriors, to be honest, and try to post something to satisfy our humanitarian needs, and then nothing happens, unfortunately. This is Omid, and I would like to go through reactions to this situation. I'll read from paper from this point because I think this should be clear about the numbers and everything. So, firstly, letting you know about a bit more about Iranian refugees in Australia. Iranian refugees in Australia are from different backgrounds, but in the past few decades, 2 groups have been more significant: Baha'is and sea arrivals. Some of Baha'i people, of course, arrived through sea, but I mean, these 2 groups of people are the most important one. In 1981, Jan McPhee, the Minister for Immigration, announced a Special Humanitarian Assistance (SHP) program under which Iranian Baha'is and others were able to seek refuge in Australia By 1986, 538 Persian Baha'is had entered Australia under the SHP program, and by 1988, some 2,500 had arrived in Australia through either the SHP or other refugee programs. Unlike the recent sea arrivals, the Baha'i community is socially more respected. Before the Australian government stopped the boats carrying refugees from entering Australia, the majority of arrivals were from Sri Lanka, Iran, and Afghanistan. In July 2013, Australia's ambassador in Iran, just a few days prior to introducing PNG solution, declared that Iranians have committed illegal migration to Australia more than any other nation. The Iranian government claims that this is the result of overrating Australia as well as underrating Iran. Definitely it's not the only reason, but it is, I agree that that is one of the reasons. They said also, which has to be taken into consideration if that's the case, and we need to really study why this happens. And the Iranian officials also said that some of them pretend to be Baha'i in order to seek refuge and job opportunities in Australia. So it means that our government failed in supporting our people, they're seeking it somewhere else. They have to lie because the rules are created in a way that there's no other ways to be truthful to them. Iranian asylum seekers used to journey to Australia via Indonesia. On July 18, 2013, the same day that they introduced PNG solution, Indonesia stopped granting Iranians visa on arrival, and it was on the request from Australian government. Australia, particularly Senator Carr, said that refugees from Iran are economic migrants rather than genuine refugees. It was this, some of those who were still are detained, including Behrouz Bouchani, were already in boats heading towards Australia or were unaware of the new policy. In response to this, when they arrived, many of them resorted to hunger strikes to protest the policy. The Australian authorities warned them that if they stopped eating, the situation would become more difficult and they wouldn't even be allowed to contact their families. In some cases, they also separated partners from each other and parents from children. The list of victims of crimes in detention is extensive, and the types of incidents include self-harm, sexual assaults, and child abuse. The large number of incidents and the fact that these are broadcasted means that the government of Australia cannot claim that they are unaware of the situation. But in response, Peter Dutton has dismissed the revelations and accused asylum seekers on Nauru of making false claims to reach Australia. We know about protection visa, and we know that it's against 1951 Refugee Convention, but also restricts refugees' right to travel outside the territory in which the visa was granted. Since that year, 1999, Australia, says William Malley, has been the most dangerous source of such violations. On the other hand, the majority of Australians consider sea arrivals economic migrants or pseudo-refugees. I'll read you some statistics now. It's a bit horrifying, but we need to be aware of that. In 2014, a nationwide poll showed that 59% of Australians claimed that boat arrivals were not genuine refugees, and 12% were unsure. The reality, however, is different. From 1976, when maritime arrivals started in Australia by Vietnamese people, we've had more than 60,000 people arriving via sea. 81% of them have been found to be refugees. And then a 2016 report showed that just 12.3% of detainees on Manus Island were not genuine refugees. In May 2016, a poll showed that 59% believe immigration levels over the past decade have been too high. Just 28% were supporting increase in refugee intake amid Europe's migration crisis. As of June 2016, around 59% of Australians agreed with both turn-backs and 42 supported offshore detention policy. It was based on around 300,000 people, respondents actually. And it means they were supporting killing, torturing, suicide, sexual assault, child abuse, and so on. In September 2016, a poll revealed that almost half of Australians agreed with a ban on Muslim immigration. The most common reasons for wanting a ban were fears over terrorism and a belief that Muslim migrants do not integrate into society nor share Australian values. That I would love to know what Australian values are, if one can tell me in the Q&A. These have contributed to the marginalization of maritime arrivals within the Iranian community in Australia as well. So many Iranians avoid talking to maritime refugees, they try to exclude them. So you can see the high pressure on this group of people. As of November 2016, a total of 928 Iranian refugees were detained by the Australian government, of whom 551 persons were inside the country and the rest were held on Manus and Nauru. Australia claims that the governments of Nauru and PNG are responsible for the situation of the centers. Then, on the other hand, Iranian officials declare that Australia doesn't allow them to visit the camps. During the past few years, Australian and Iranian governments have had some negotiations, but despite some verbal progress, nothing has happened. Australia prefers forced deportation, but Iran claims that it will not practice mandatory repatriation. And that's the limbo which is supported from every possible side that you can think of. Thank you. I would like to hear your questions and comments now.
Thank you very much, Houman, for a very thought-provoking paper. It's been a great panel, so it's been a great panel to chair. So I want to open questions from the floor, open up the floor to questions. So it's been a long day. So any questions or comments? People collecting their thoughts. Okay, well, I might use Chair's prerogative again. So I was curious, in terms of Iranian refugees, do you think that part of the reason why, and this is my perception, why they have perhaps the least sympathy out of a lot of the different groups is because, for two reasons. One is that a lot of them are seen as economic migrants as opposed to genuine refugees. And the other one is the religious factor. That the vast majority of them are Muslim as well. And, with Islamophobia, this is like the least desired kind of, any sort of immigrant or refugee or, migrant of any type. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think when we talk about religion today in terms of migration and racism and xenophobia, I think religion is more of a kind of something that is tied to ethnicity. So, for example, when we talk about Muslims in Australia, we're not concerned about Indonesians. We're concerned about Middle Easterners. And I think apart from this poverty or difficulty of the situation of the person in their homeland, the worse your situation is, the less your chance to get opportunity elsewhere. And it's not all about Australia, it's about other countries as well. My problem with Australia's migration and refugee policies is that this is a migration nation. And that's why that we need to be, actually, we need to realize that we have a big responsibility, not only for that, but also for all the wars that Australia is a part of, the US-led wars from Vietnam to Afghanistan and Iraq. If you don't want to have refugees, don't go to wars.
That's a very good point. Jimmy?
That was a really timely and important paper. I was wondering if you could comment on the case of Mojgan Shamsul for the Iranian student facing deportation in this state.
So what was the name again?
Mojgan.
Mojgan?
And the community response to her. She's a year 12 student who's was denied a partner visa and is facing deportation back to Iran. But there seems to be a very strong community response in defence of her in Brisbane. Does that buck the trend in terms of what you were saying about the...
Honestly, I'm not really, I haven't studied that case to answer your question, but if you ask me, what do I think about deporting someone, a year 12 student from Australia to the homeland, so the answer is clearly all of us, I think, agree that it's not really humane to do it. But we are taking things to another level by deporting children. I think that's so dangerous because we know that deportation is not something that the government is afraid of doing. But the problem is it's getting worse and worse. And by allowing this to happen, that's the problem. Then again, we have some moments to take things further. Look at Jamal Khashoggi's case in Saudi Arabia. It's gonna stop war in Yemen and US sending weapons to Saudi Arabia. At least it's been discussed widely and among US politicians. But if we didn't actually have that huge response from the media and public, we wouldn't be able to do it. So if something like this happens, we need to be, these are like rare moments, because if the second student is going to get deported, we're not going to have even this type of support for them.
Any more questions and comments? Yeah, I might ask another question or another comment. So, in terms of kind of I think you mentioned this towards the end, kind of limbo, that I'm sure it's not just Iranian refugees, but you kind of spoke about the fact that their home government doesn't want them back either, and the Israeli government won't let them stay. I'm kind of curious about the motivation from the Iranian side, like why, if there was okay, fair enough, they might be disappointed that they left the country, but if there was a choice between letting them kind of drop in like Manus Island or Nauru and having them come back home, like why would they not choose the former? I mean the latter.
The problem is, I think Iranian government in that specific sense is saying something more acceptable. It says, look, we're not gonna enforce people to return to their homeland. But if they would like to come back, they're most welcome. It's their land and they can come over. But those refugees say that there is no guarantee that we return and you actually treat us well. But I would say, no, mandatory repatriation is not a good thing. It is something that Australia wants, and Australia has shown that they're not in support of maritime refugees.
Well, I mean, my kind of view on it is, when people, especially when they're trying to make the argument about, it's economic migrants, not refugees, especially if you're coming by boat. I mean, you have to be pretty desperate to get on a boat to reach a country so far away. And in my mind, I don't think you would do it for economic motivations. You would have to be very desperate, and there'd have to be a lot of other issues. You'd actually feel that you're not safe wherever you came from for various reasons. So that's all my kind of take on that. When people kind of try to make the argument, these are just economic migrants. They're just trying to skip the queue, which of course is the other common kind of phrase used in Australia.
Yeah.
People arriving. Well, and actually, this is a bit of a broader kind of point, but I've always been curious what it is about people arriving in boats in Australia that really seems to kind of tap into something in the national psyche about, and I'm a historian by training, and I have views on this, that maybe it goes back to, settlement, European settlement, and that's always been the perennial fear of especially Asians arriving on the north coast of Australia. So you have this policy which is out of all proportion. I mean, if you look at the numbers involved, they're really a drop in the ocean in terms of like total immigration to Australia. But you have this very, hardcore bipartisan kind of support for this policy, like, no, we can't let people arrive by boat and we can't let people skip the queue. That's not what I want. So yeah, I do find it quite disturbing. But yeah, and also, yeah, like I said, I have my own thoughts on why it is. But yeah, it really does seem to be out of all proportion to the numbers. Why Australia feels it needs to have this offshore detention policy.
Yes, I mean, again, statistics, they show that a large majority of them are based on even this government's reports. They are genuine refugees, there's no lie behind it.
And what's the long-term objective? I mean, are they just going to be just indefinitely in these detention centers? I mean, what's the long-term?
Well, this is one of the most interesting unanswered questions in the past 5.5 years, I guess, and I have no clue to that either. I think it just depends on the next government, not this one. And what I understand out of this situation is that you are enforcing people to lie more and more. They had reasons to come over, no doubt. But if you say, for example, you came here for this reason, it's unacceptable, they will have to bring more and more reasons. And the bigger picture, and the more horrifying picture is that these become the base for humanitarian reports on countries like Iran. So Human Rights Watch, they don't write about universal healthcare for refugees in Iran, but they do write about one single refugee being under pressure in Iran. Okay? I don't say that that's a good condition for refugees in Iran. It's not a wealthy country. It's not supported by the West, Australia, Northern America, none of them as much to be supporting them. But at the same time, the country has been dealing with its internal, external problems together with 3 million refugees over the 40 years, like the public frustration about that and all those kind of things. And imagine these people flee the country and they become a part of those humanitarian reports, and then they write things about Iran, and these things become the base of sanctions on the country. The same families, the same people have to suffer from those sanctions. And this is like, this loop is so problematic. We need to...
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, like, I just sometimes think that rather than trying to say, oh, this person has a right to be here, they have to be a refugee or not. We need to challenge the fundamentals of these kind of policies. That do we really need to have it? Why do we need to actually ask people about leaving the countries or their homelands? This is more important to me than like taking some individuals into consideration, saying that, okay, these people, are they going to be here or there? It is important as a step towards it, but I mean, let's not play with their cards. Let's play our own game and say, look, this is fundamentally wrong.